I was elbow-deep in pig feed when I heard the screech that would change everything. It was a sound so piercing, so full of indignation, that it could only belong to one person, Margaret, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA. Margaret was the kind of woman who believed she could control everything, including my pigs. I turned, wiping my hands on my overalls, just in time to see her storming across my yard like a woman possessed. Clipboard in one hand, phone in the other, probably already dialing the authorities, her high heels sank into the mud with each aggressive step. But she was too furious to care. This, she gestured wildly at my pigs, Snorty, Baconator, and Sir Inksalot, is an absolute disgrace to our community. This is not a farm. It's a neighborhood. You have exactly 1 week to get rid of these disgusting creatures, or I will make sure you regret it. I crossed my arms, watching as Snorty, the smartest of my pigs, waddled over and sniffed Margaret's designer purse with a delighted grunt. He chomped down on the expensive leather strap. Margaret let out a shriek so dramatic that birds took off from the trees. She yanked the bag away and shot me a glare capable of melting steel. "Are you even listening to me?" she snapped, checking her purse for damages. I smiled, slow and steady. "Loud and clear, Margaret. But I don't think you understand. I'm not getting rid of my pigs." Her mouth fell open like I had just declared war. "Excuse me? This is an HOA community. You signed an agreement." I wiped my hands again, my patience thinner than the HOA rulebook she clutched like a Bible. "Funny thing, Margaret. Nowhere in that agreement does it actually say I can't have pigs." For a second, she looked stunned. Then her face twisted into something smug, something dangerous. "Oh, you think you're clever? Fine. If you want to play games, I'll show you how this works. I'll have you find so much you'll be begging to get rid of them. You have no idea who you're messing with." She turned on her heel and stomped back toward her pristine beige-colored house. I watched her go, feeling the weight of what had just happened settle in. Margaret wasn't just annoyed, she was out for blood. The war had begun. The next 2 days were a whirlwind of passive-aggressive HOA notices stuffed into my mailbox. Each one was more ridiculous than the last. First, it was a noise complaint about the pigs oinking funny, considering my neighbor's dog barked like a maniac all night and no one seemed to mind. Then it was a smell violation, as if Margaret's rose-scented garbage bins weren't contributing their own brand of horror to the air. The last one was the kicker, a formal notice demanding the removal of all non-standard domestic animals within 7 days or face an escalation of consequences. Escalation of consequences? I muttered, staring at the pile of papers on my kitchen table. What did that even mean? Was she planning to take me to pig court? I sighed. There was no way I was letting Margaret bully me into submission, but I had to be smart about it. She was already rallying the HOA board against me, spreading exaggerated tales of how my pigs were endangering neighborhood children and decreasing property values. So, if Margaret wanted to play dirty, I'd play bigger. The idea hit me while watching Snorty chase a wind-blown plastic bag across the yard. The way he zigzagged, his little hooves kicking up dirt, his determination unwavering, it looked like a race. And that's when it clicked. If Margaret wanted to turn my pigs into a spectacle, I'd make sure the whole neighborhood was watching. I would host a full-scale pig racing event. I started making calls, reaching out to neighbors who were just as fed up with the HOA as I was. Turns out, I wasn't alone. Half the neighborhood had some kind of grudge against Margaret, from her enforcing acceptable holiday decor to banning lawn flamingos. People were tired of her dictatorship. "So, let me get this straight," my friend Jake said over the phone. "You're going to race pigs in the middle of the neighborhood?" "Exactly," I replied. "And you think the HOA is just going to let that slide?" I grinned. "Not at all. But by the time they realize what's happening, it'll be too late to stop it." Jake let out a slow, impressed whistle. "This is either genius or the dumbest thing you've ever done." "Both can be true," I said. Word spread fast. A few parents with young kids loved the idea. Some of the older folks thought it was hilarious. Even the local news reporter, a guy named Travis who lived a few blocks down, got wind of it and sent me a text. "If this actually happens, I want an exclusive interview." Meanwhile, Margaret had no idea what was coming. She was too busy parading around the neighborhood, bragging about how the pig menace would soon be handled. But my plan was already in motion. I built a makeshift racetrack in my backyard, complete with hay bales and checkered flags. I trained my pigs, rewarding them with treats every time they made it across the finish line. By the time Margaret realized what was happening, flyers for the first annual HOA Pig Grand Prix were already circulating. The morning of the race, Margaret stormed into my yard uninvited, her face redder than a sunburn. "You have got to be kidding me," she hissed. I casually adjusted a race sign. "Good morning, Margaret. Here to place a bet." "You think this little stunt is funny?" she spat. "You think you can just turn our neighborhood into some kind of county fair?" I shrugged. "Funny how that works, since the HOA doesn't technically ban pig racing. There's no violation here." Her jaw clenched so tight I thought she might crack a tooth. "I will not allow this. I will shut this down." "You're welcome to try," I said, knowing full well what was coming. She'd try to call animal control, the city council, maybe even the mayor. But I also knew something she didn't. The whole neighborhood was already on my side. By the time Margaret realized the pig race was a full-fledged event, it was far too late to stop it. I had worked fast, recruiting every neighbor who had a bone to pick with the HOA. People who had been forced to repaint their mailboxes, fined for parking too close to the curb, and even a guy who had been yelled at for having wind chimes that disturbed the aesthetic of the community. They were all ready for some chaos, and chaos was exactly what I was delivering. Training the pigs turned out to be more entertaining than I expected. Sir Ikesalot was a natural, charging forward with the determination of a tiny four-legged athlete. Snorty, on the other hand, needed a little extra motivation. That motivation turned out to be food, specifically, my mom's homemade cornbread, which he would have sprinted through fire to get. Baconator was unpredictable. Sometimes he ran. Sometimes he wandered off in the middle of a race to investigate a butterfly. It was a wild card situation, but I wasn't worried. The goal wasn't just to win. The goal was to make this event legendary. The neighborhood buzzed with anticipation. People who never spoke to each other were suddenly gathering on sidewalks to discuss pig racing strategies. Bets were placed, and someone even suggested live streaming the event. The HOA might have been built on rules, but this neighborhood had just found something even more powerful: fun. Margaret, of course, was losing her mind. I caught her marching from house to house, clipboard in hand, demanding people stop supporting this nonsense and threatening to report them for the most ridiculous infractions. "Did you know," she hissed at old Mrs. Patterson, "that your garden gnome technically violates the HOA's approved lawn ornament policy?" Mrs. Patterson, who had lived in the neighborhood for 30 years, just smiled sweetly and told her she'd consider replacing it. That same night, 3 more garden gnomes mysteriously appeared on her lawn, all dressed in tiny pig-themed outfits. Margaret wasn't just angry anymore. She was desperate. And desperate people did reckless things. The night before the big race, I found Margaret lurking near my yard, whispering furiously into her phone. I stepped onto my porch, arms crossed. "Need something, Margaret?" She stiffened like a kid caught stealing cookies. Then, in a voice too sugary to be real, she said, "Just making sure there won't be any unfortunate surprises tomorrow." "You wouldn't want anything to go wrong, would you?" I tilted my head, studying her. She had something planned. I can see it in the way her lips curled just slightly upward, the way she gripped her phone like she was holding onto a secret weapon. But whatever she was cooking up, I wasn't worried. I had the entire neighborhood on my side. She was one woman against a revolution. The morning of the race was perfect: bright blue skies, warm sun, and a crowd bigger than I ever expected. People had brought lawn chairs, coolers, and even snacks, like this was a full-blown festival. Someone had set up a makeshift announcer booth with a microphone. Kids were running around with signs that said things like "Go Snorty" and "Team Baconator." It was everything I had hoped for and more. Then Margaret showed up. She wasn't alone. Trailing behind her were 2 serious-looking men in suits and a woman in an animal control uniform. Margaret strode through the crowd like she was leading an army, a smug grin stretched across her face. "Attention, everyone," she called, raising a hand like she was addressing her royal subjects. "I regret to inform you all that this event is over permanently." The crowd murmured, but no one moved. Margaret's grin widened. She gestured to the men beside her. "These gentlemen are HOA representatives, here to assess this blatant violation of community rules. And this," she turned to the animal control officer, "is here to remove the pigs." A hush fell over the crowd. My stomach clenched. I had expected Margaret to try something, but this, bringing in an actual officer to take my pigs, that was a new low. The animal control officer cleared her throat, looking uncomfortable. Actually, ma'am, I'm just here to verify that the animals are being cared for properly. I'm not authorized to remove them unless they're in distress or being mistreated." Margaret's eye twitched. Of course. But surely you can see how unsanitary this is, farm animals in a residential neighborhood? The officer glanced at my pigs, who were lounging comfortably in their designated area, snacking on some treats. They looked pretty happy to me. Margaret's expression twisted. She turned to the HOA men. "And you too? You can shut this down, can't you?" One of them, a guy named Greg who had the dead-eyed look of someone who deeply regretted being here, shuffled through some papers. "Technically, there's no specific rule against pig racing. The HOA has rules against farm animals being kept in conditions that could be considered disruptive, but these animals seem well contained." Margaret's face turned a dangerous shade of red. "Unbelievable. You people are useless." She whirled back to me, eyes blazing. "Fine. You think you've won? Think again." I barely had time to wonder what she meant before she pulled out her own secret weapon, a tiny, furious Pomeranian named Duke. Before I could react, Margaret unclipped Duke's leash. The little dog took off like a missile, barking furiously and charging straight at the pigs. The chaos was instant. Sir Lancelot squealed and bolted, followed closely by Snorty and Baconator. The crowd gasped as the pigs scattered, dashing across the yard. But then something incredible happened. The pigs didn't just run. They ran in the exact paths they had been trained to. Snorty, now fully in race mode, charged forward with determination. Sir Lancelot barreled ahead, his tiny legs a blur. Even Baconator, startled into motion, took off down the track. The race had officially begun. People cheered, bets were shouted, and someone even started blasting music from a portable speaker. Margaret, realizing she had just accidentally started the event instead of stopping it, looked horrified. The pigs raced toward the finish line, dodging Duke, who was still yapping madly behind them. It was a close call. Snorty and Sir Lancelot were neck and neck. The crowd held their breath as the finish line drew closer. And then, at the very last second, Baconator's sweet, unpredictable Baconator made a sudden burst of speed and crossed the finish line first. The crowd went wild. People cheered, high-fived, and someone even popped open a soda like they were celebrating the Super Bowl. I stood there, grinning, as Margaret looked like she was about to combust. "This isn't over," she seethed, but her voice was drowned out by the victory celebrations. I bent down, scooping up Baconator and holding him triumphantly above my head. "We have a winner," I announced. Margaret stomped away, but no one cared anymore. The HOA had failed, the pigs had won, and the neighborhood had just experienced the most exciting event in its history. And the best part? This was only the beginning. Margaret was seething. She had come expecting to shut the entire thing down, to have me humiliated in front of the entire neighborhood, to prove that she still held absolute control over the HOA. Instead, she had accidentally triggered the greatest community event in the neighborhood's history. And worst of all, my pigs had just become local legends. People were still cheering, patting me on the back, and taking pictures with Baconator, who looked immensely pleased with himself. Even the HOA representatives, who had originally shown up with the intent of finding violations, were awkwardly clapping along, as if realizing there was no stopping this momentum. Margaret, however, wasn't ready to accept defeat. She stormed up to me, her heels sinking into the dirt with each furious step, her expression a mask of barely contained rage. "This," she spat, pointing a trembling finger at the racetrack, at the pigs, at the entire crowd, "is a disgrace. An absolute embarrassment to our neighborhood. You think this is funny? You think you can just ignore the rules?" I smiled, but there was steel behind it. "I think the neighborhood just voted, Margaret. And they seemed pretty happy." She whipped around, scanning the faces of the people she had once controlled with an iron grip. But something had changed. The same neighbors who used to fear her fines and threats were now laughing, taking pictures, and enjoying themselves in a way they never had before. Margaret wasn't the center of attention anymore. The HOA's power wasn't absolute, and she knew it. Her jaw tightened. "This isn't over. You may have gotten away with this little stunt, but I am filing an official complaint. I will have the HOA rewrite the bylaws to ensure that this sort of nonsense never happens again. You will be fined. You will be forced to sell those disgusting animals. And if you refuse, I will see to it that you are removed from this neighborhood. I crossed my arms, unfazed. Good luck with that. She didn't get the reaction she wanted. There was no fear, no scrambling to appease her. If anything, I could see the doubt flickering in her eyes as she realized she had lost more than just a battle today. She had lost the neighborhood. As if on cue, a voice spoke up from the crowd. Actually, Margaret, I think we need to talk about who's really damaging the neighborhood. Everyone turned. It was Greg, the HOA board member who had reluctantly come along for Margaret's failed coup. He was still holding the official HOA rulebook, but now he wasn't looking at me. He was looking at her. Margaret blinked. Excuse me. Greg cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. We've been getting a lot of complaints about you. About your handling of the HOA. About the way you've been targeting certain homeowners unfairly. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. I saw nods, exchanged glances, little moments of agreement that made Margaret's face pale. That's ridiculous, she snapped. I have only ever enforced the rules. Greg hesitated before sighing. Actually, after looking into it, we've realized you've been enforcing selective rules. For instance, you fined the Hendersons for their garden gnome but let your own decorative flamingo slide. You gave multiple warnings about mailbox colors but never addressed the people who left trash cans out for days. Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. She turned red, then white, then red again. I was acting in the best interest of the community. Another voice piped up. So was he. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly neighbor Margaret had tried to intimidate, stepped forward. This pig race brought us together. When was the last time you did something that actually made this neighborhood feel like a community? Margaret looked ready to combust. You can't be serious. Greg shifted awkwardly. The thing is, a lot of people are unhappy. And, well, according to HOA bylaws, board members can be voted out by a majority vote. Margaret let out a harsh laugh. You think these people, these idiots, would actually try to vote me out? Silence. And then, like a slow building storm, voices began to rise. I vote her out. Me too. She fined me for having a bird feeder. I want her gone. One by one, hands went up. People who had once been afraid of her were standing against her. The power she had clung to for years was slipping through her fingers, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Margaret turned back to Greg, desperate. You can't let them do this. Greg sighed. It's in the bylaws, Margaret. It took less than 10 minutes. The vote was counted, and just like that, Margaret was officially removed from her position as HOA president. She stood there in stunned silence as the realization sank in. For the first time in years, she had no authority, no power, no control. And then, to add insult to injury, a loud, wet snort echoed through the air. Sir Oinksalot, standing nearby, stared at Margaret with his usual blank expression. Then he lifted his snout and sneezed directly onto her. The crowd erupted into laughter. Margaret, shaking with rage and possibly disgust, took a step back. Her heel caught in the mud, and with a shriek, she tumbled backward, landing flat on her back in a glorious muddy mess. The laughter grew deafening. People were crying, clutching their stomachs, doubling over in pure joy. Even Greg had to turn away to hide his smirk. I almost felt bad for Margaret. Almost. She scrambled to her feet, sputtering, her designer clothes ruined, her pride shattered. She didn't say a word. She just turned and stomped away, mud dripping from her ruined outfit. A few minutes later, the sound of a car screeching out of the neighborhood signaled that Margaret was officially gone. The celebration lasted well into the evening. People brought food, music played, and my pigs basked in the glow of their newfound fame. The HOA, now free from Margaret's reign of terror, seemed much more willing to let the pig racing tradition continue. In fact, Greg approached me before the night was over with an offer that I never saw coming. So, he said, rubbing the back of his neck. Now that Margaret's out, we need a new HOA president. I nearly choked on my soda. Oh no. Oh yes, he said, grinning. People want someone fair, someone the community actually likes. And, well, you just pulled off the biggest event in neighborhood history. I looked around, taking in the happy faces, the laughter, the way people were actually enjoying themselves for once. Maybe the HOA wasn't the problem. Maybe it had just needed better leadership. And who better to fix things than the guy who had just successfully overthrown the most hated HOA president of all time? I sighed dramatically. Fine, but only under one condition. Greg raised an eyebrow. What's that? I grinned. Sir Ikesalot gets to be the official HOA mascot. And that's how I became the new HOA president. As for Margaret, she moved out within a month. Rumor had it she tried to join another HOA, but the second they heard about her reputation, they politely suggested she look elsewhere. And the pig races? They became an annual tradition. Turns out, sometimes the best way to fight ridiculous rules isn't with anger, it's with a little bit of chaos and a whole lot of pigs. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.